Hey everyone, it's VM Campos, comic book fan. Welcome to another episode of the weekly VM Campos Comic Book Club. For the audio version of the podcast, head on over to your favorite podcasting app, search VM Campos, and subscribe. This is the series where I review a comic book, new or old, from my collection for the following 5 dimensions: cover art, interior art, plot, and enjoyability of the book on a scale of 1 to 5. Now, spoiler alert, I will be going through the various pages of this comic book, so you're warned about that. What I recommend, however, is go to your favorite comic shops and actually buy the books I talk about. Support your favorite creators, companies, and comics, and buy the books I talk about. It's really worth it. This week I'm reading Hate Number 1. Third printing, published by Fantagraphics in 1992. Let's get started. Alright, so the backstory about this book is it's published by Fantagraphics, an independent publisher that was around for several years, and this book is a seminal work in the underground indie world of the 90s. Peter Bagge published this book via Fantagraphics, and it follows the exploits of Buddy Bradley and his family. He's basically a slacker living in Washington State. This comic really captured the zeitgeist of grunge in Washington, in Seattle, in the early 90s. And I wasn't reading it back in the day, in 1990 and such. I was still reading Spider-Man comics, but I would see these sort of independent comics at the comic shop, and I thought, wow, those aren't for me. They're like too grown up. I don't understand them. So I never really read them, but I know about them, and I picked up issues later on. I bought this on eBay, and I accidentally bought the third printing, printed in 1992. First printing is 1990, but when I bought it off of eBay, the person selling it, they themselves didn't know it was also the third printing, so I got a little bit of a refund, and I'll probably get first printing at some point. It's in really nice condition, and of course the story is what matters most, but I'm reading Hate Number 1, third printing this week. Let's start off with the cover. Okay, this is a hilarious over-the-top cover that has nothing to do really with what the book is about. The character of Buddy Bradley was first introduced in Bagge's other comic book, Neat Stuff. Basically, he's a slacker in the Neat Stuff. He was living at home, I believe, and in this one he moves out. But he's this total slacker, kind of aimless, perfect encapsulation of Gen X. And you got to think about that in the early 90s, very late 80s, that sort of term Gen X wasn't really around. I think they were calling them the Echo Boomers. Okay, Boomer. So this cover has nothing to do with the character. He's not a beer-swilling, well, not Coors at least. He's not a mainstream beer-swilling guy that is like, USA, we're number 1, and then with a huge truck and like so consumerist. This cover's hilarious. I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5 just because it doesn't really encompass what's in the actual book, but there's a lot of detail for you just to kind of browse, kind of find fun stuff about it, like, attention, all you smart capitalist investors, this is issue number 1. And then we've got, this is $2 in the USA, we're number 1, $2.50 in Canada, they're not number 1. Just a lot of little funny things to write about there. Now, there is a slur in here that I will not read, but I guess the irony of saying that slur and such is that, you know, this character is not this representation, so they wouldn't say that, but it's right there on the cover, so I'm going to skip that. It's going to ding it also down to 4 out of 5. So it's just weird, and seeing this on the shelf is just hilarious. So fun cover. Interior art. Well, Peter Bagge is the artist. There are 2 stories. There's the My Pad storyline, and there's Trapped on Hate Island. So the style of this, I often talk about in my podcast about how I love the black and white independent comics of the 80s, but there were also some amazing black and white independent comics of the 90s. I don't know why I feel like I have a little bit less of a connection with them, even though that was during like my time. The indie comics of the 80s were before my time. I was like heavily enmeshed in Spider-Man. But after kind of going back, now that I'm a grown-up and I can buy more comics, and going back and getting some of these comics, you know, like also Roberta Gregory's comics and such, it's really cool to see what that generation of comics was about. Everyone's got their own style. And so Peter Bag's style, I think it's very recognizable. And in this first story, you definitely see it. We've got Peter, we eventually see Stinky, and one of the other roommates that lives in their place. So the art is really fun. I'm going to give this a 4 out of 5. It's this black and white cartoony style, over-the-top expressions. It can get kind of cluttered. There's a lot of text. I think that's what separates this comic from some other comics. The styles of comics is that it's very wordy. There's a lot to talk about. It reminds me of a Kevin Smith movie and such, which is fun. And so the focus on the art, when you focus on the art there's some realism, there's some surrealism, and it's just really cool. There's some asides, motion lines and such. It's a really cool art for that first story. The second story is Prisoners of Hate Island. It's the same artist, the same creator and everything, and this is slightly more realistic because there are actually caricatures here of Peter Bag himself, Kim Thompson, the publisher at Fantagraphics, and one more, I believe, and then another important figure in the world of comics publishing at the time. So this art's really cool as well. I'll give this a little higher. It's a 5 out of 5 because it really does great caricature with real characters, but then in Peter Bag's style. So really fun interior art. Moving on to the plots, they're both really cool. The second one, it is much more a fourth wall breaking sort of plot. It's the creator of Hate himself just talking about how he has nothing to show for it and his comics don't sell, and he wants advice on how to really sell more comics in this modern time. And then the other people there kind of give him a little bit of advice, but they're like, well, who cares? Independent comics are all about doing what you want, even if you're not going to be profitable. So it's kind of a really interesting plot in terms of it's a comic book about a comic book, and it's just so 90s to be that sort of introspective about things. So I appreciate that. Then if you've never read Hate before, the first story, Welcome to My Pad, is also a very good introduction to the characters, about their idiosyncrasies, and it's such a fourth wall breaking story. Buddy is talking to you as if you're visiting him. It starts off with, hey man, long time no see, I can't believe you were able to track me down, come on and set a spell. So again, a little bit of fourth wall breaking and ironic humor and such, because if you were following his comic over at Neat Stuff, here now he's got his own comic as Hate. And he's introducing you to, well, we lived in New Jersey, and then we moved over here and there, and we were thinking of going to California, but instead we went to Seattle, and here we are. And just like this great slacker lifestyle, it's sort of like you should have been there, you had to be there mentality to it all. So it's really fun. And I'm kind of having flashbacks. I don't think I ever owned this comic, but I think I might have read it in a trade paperback or at a library or somewhere, because there's a few shots and a few plots that I swear that I remember, that I swear I'm getting deja vu on, but I never owned this comic. There's a wrecking ball scene that I swear I remember that I've read that before, but oh well. So I'm giving both of the plots a 5 out of 5. I love the introduction to these characters in the first story, and then I like the sort of like existentialism of the second story. I think they're done very well. They're very funny. There's a little bit of vulgarity here and there, but that's on par for independent comics. They do what they want. So both stories are very enjoyable, which then leads us to the enjoyability of the book. I give that also a 5 out of 5. You really have to check out these independent comics, and even though this is already, 30 years old, hard to believe, it still feels fresh and vital. And now, because we've kind of lost time for the last few decades, you can easily define the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. Then when we get to the 2000s and the 2010s, it's like they all start to blur together. But it's kind of cool to see this time capsule of things, and you've got to check this book out if you're only into the heroes, superheroes and such. They're cool and all of that, but real stories of, quote, real people, well, hyper real people, is something that is also enjoyable to me. So I give this a 5 out of 5. 2 stories for the price of one, and of them for only $2 American. Pretty funny, pretty weird, little gross here and there. After all, the cover states recommended for mature, patriotic readers. So once again, if you'd like to hear the audio version of the podcast, head on over to all your favorite podcast apps. I'm on all of them. Spotify, Pandora, etc., etc. Search VM Campos and subscribe for free. Head on over to patreon.com/vmcampos, and you can also subscribe there for free to keep up to date with everything that I do regarding comics, San Diego Comic-Con, cosplay, Magic the Gathering, all of that for free. Go to the $1 tier and you'll unlock some cool stuff. Go to the $2 tier and I'll actually mail you a comic book in thanks. In the event, like, share, comment on my content. I really appreciate that as well. So this week I read Hate #1, third printing, published in 1992, originally published in 1990 by Fantagraphics. This has been the weekly VM Campos Comic Book Club, and I'll see you next week.